Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's 10 o'clock, so I think we'll get started here. So today's webinar is titled Water Sustainability in Alberta's Agriculture Through Digitalization, Preliminary Policy Lab Findings. So this webinar will focus on the preliminary findings from the Simpson Center's first two policy lab sessions, investigating water sustainability in Alberta's agriculture through digitalization. And this is under the Alberta Digitalization Agriculture Program funded by the Government of Alberta. My name is Roshan Sahota. I'm a project coordinator at the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy. We're based at the University of Calgary's Faculty of Veterinary Medicine. So the University of Calgary, located in the heart of Southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation within Alberta, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. Before I introduce our speaker for today, here are a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you are having difficulties hearing the webinar today or are experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number in your webinar registration email or click the arrow next to the microphone icon and press switch to phone audio. Today's event will consist of a presentation from our speaker followed a Q&A session, which I will be moderating. There is a box labeled Q&A where you can pose a question to our speaker. We'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can during the Q&A period. However, if your question is not covered or if you have additional suggestions or feedback, please feel free to email the speaker directly. The contact details are available in the registration email and will also be provided at the end of the presentation. Finally, please be aware that this event is being recorded. You will receive the recording in an email as well as a post-event survey after the webinar. We may also take clips from the video and post them on social media. With the housekeeping items now in order, I want to introduce our speaker. Dr. Juhi Huda is a research associate at the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy with expertise in food systems governance, water sustainability, climate change, and disasters and hazards. At the Simpson Center, she is leading the Policy Lab initiative under the Government of Alberta funded Alberta Digitalization Agriculture Program, as well as the BMO-funded Agricultural Literacy Program. Before joining the Simpson Center, she was an assistant professor at Flame University in Pune, India, and a postdoctoral researcher at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She holds a PhD in environmental studies from the University of Colorado Boulder. Welcome, Juhi. So after Juhi's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, so be sure to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. And I will now pass it off to Juhi to start the presentation.
Thanks so much, Roshan. So before I begin, I do want to acknowledge my team members. So you've already met Roshan, who's the project coordinator and instrumental in organizing all the policy lab sessions, as well as arranging this webinar. We've got Hanan Ishaq on our team, who's the research lead for the ABDIAG program that was mentioned. He's a senior policy analyst at the Simpson Center. And then this project is conducted under the supervision of our director, Guillaume Laramie. For those of you who are not as familiar with the Simpson Center, I do want to take a moment to familiarize you with it. We are an academic policy institute with an aim to translate the academic research that is happening within universities in order to inform public opinion in such a way that there is policy impact so that we can drive public policy. And our projects largely focus on being able to strengthen the sustainability of Canadian agriculture. And so it's within this gambit that we have the Government of Alberta funded ABDIAG program. It began in 2023 and we are nearing the end. It ends in mid-2026. It is an applied policy research and outreach project where we are trying to understand what the challenges are in digitalization of agriculture and what might be the opportunities to kind of promote the adoption of these technologies out there, with the ultimate goal to provide policy recommendations to GOA. How are we going about this is first, of course, the academic research. So looking at the current level of agricultural digitalization happening out there, studying the policies that are existent in other regions of the country, the world, etc., to figure out how can we encourage digitalization of ag practices. We do want to use a participatory approach, Policy Lab being one of those participatory approaches. And ultimately, the aim is knowledge transfer. That's how we inform public opinion. But those who are kind of familiar with participatory approaches, you might realize that digitalization in agriculture is this really big thing. And one thing that often works when we want to get substantive results is to have a more narrow focus. And so for this policy lab, what we are doing is we are focusing on water sustainability within Alberta's agriculture. Several reasons for doing that. Anybody who has spent any time in Alberta would realize, that we have ongoing challenges in water availability. I have some news headlines from early last year, where in the beginning of the year, we had news, saying the prairies are heading into another drought. The era of abundant water in Alberta is at an end. So later in spring, April, the government came together with some of the major license holders to make some voluntary water sharing agreements where the major water license holders agreed to kind of give up some of their share of their water. But then fast track to fall in September, we have another headline. Many Alberta farmers found relief after staring down drought. What that translates into is some of these water sharing agreements actually didn't really go into place, and the others were enacted, but then were discontinued because the water availability situation changed. And so it's a very dynamic situation, which needs kind of these innovative approaches, is what we thought. And so we are focusing on water sustainability. And the approach that we are taking in this, what we are calling the policy lab, is a bit more than stakeholder consultations, where we are directly working with producers who are not just consulted, but they work alongside other relevant actors within this field. And the goal of this project is to eventually formulate a mutually beneficial strategy for water sustainability. Lots of big terms over here, I realize, and especially when we say sustainability, a term that has been in existence for a long time, a few decades at least. And so I'm often asked when I'm talking about the policy lab, how do you define sustainability? So I wanted to include that in here. We are going back to kind of one of the oldest definitions, being mindful of, being able to fulfill the needs of the current as well as the future generations. But we are talking about here water sustainability in agriculture. So there are three different foci in some ways for sustainability. So what do I mean when I say sustainability for water resources? Again, being mindful of current and future needs as a society, but within kind of the lens of environmental, ecological, and hydrological integrity being maintained. When we talk about sustainability in agriculture, what do we mean? Safe practices, but being mindful of environmental and socioeconomic dimensions in this case. And then lastly, bringing this together, what do we mean by sustainability in water resources in agriculture? The economic dimension, we do want to increase crop production, but at the same time, we want to also minimize water losses. So just defining the scope of this project in some ways by putting forth some definitions that we're working with. But again, they change, evolve. If through feedback, we realize we've kind of, forgotten something, need to include something, but making sure the scope is understood. The other big term in the title was digitalization. So what do we mean by digitalization? Again, broadly conceived, the use of digital technology and data to improve farming decisions. And so I have some examples up here, such as sensors, satellites, so actual things, but then it could also be something like cloud storage, so data management and things like that also fall under digitalization. And then the last big term, which at least some of y'all must have been wondering, is in what is the policy lab, right? So Alberta has been doing what are called as living labs or agrosystem living labs. And so this kind of falls under that, but more policy focused. A policy lab as a concept has been in existence for about a decade. And so it's relatively new, used interchangeably. So I have some kind of pointers here in terms of what falls under a policy lab. One, it has to be collaborative, where people from different sectors come together to create. So with stakeholder consultations, it's more consultation happening, but here it's creation, a much more bottom-up approach when we are testing new policy ideas. And then again, drawing from research, it uses design thinking, evidence, and then lots of feedback from the participants themselves to solve complex issues. So again, through stakeholder involvement. So some key elements of a policy lab, beginning with problem definition. So we don't go to the table with like, okay, this is what we think is the problem, what might be some solutions, and then we probably already have some solutions. So here we are starting again from the ground up. Talking to those who are impacted, defining the problem with them, that's the stakeholder engagement part. Going back to the drawing table, doing some research, some analysis, coming up with more ideas, prototyping, testing and iteration, and then finally implementation. And if that's successful, then scaling that up. So I had 3 slides on definitional aspects on sustainability, on digitalization, and the policy lab. Putting that all together into what is the Simpson Center's policy lab about. It's focused on water sustainability in Alberta's agriculture. Pretty complex, lots of actors involved, multidimensional, environmental, economic, as well as technological, maybe some others. We are trying to use an innovative approach, such as the policy lab, which provides both a structured yet a flexible environment. And as I get into the findings, you'll see how it's structured and yet flexible. A place where stakeholders can collaboratively explore, where we will build this roadmap to water sustainability. And what the Simpson Center is doing is facilitating this evidence-based dialogue, fostering inclusive engagement, such that it reflects both the scientific insights, so that's the academic research, as well as the lived experiences of those who are actually impacted by these issues, and ultimately leading to co-creation of knowledge. So a snapshot of the journey of our policy lab. Prashant mentioned, I'll be presenting findings of the first 2 sessions, which are listed over here. It's a roadmap in some ways, but as you can see, it's kind of really up curvy, and it's purposefully chosen because anything collaborative, working with participants, a lot of iterative feedback, we kind of take turns, go back, sometimes U-turns, and then come back. And so that's kind of reflective over here. Our first session was in November of last year, where we started with that problem definition of, what are those challenges? In March of this year, we looked at key areas for policy intervention. And in December, we'll be now moving towards that roadmap that I was talking about earlier. And as you can see, the inclusive engagement, the months over here are kind of designed around the harvest season so that we can ensure there is inclusive participation of those who are really impacted by these issues. Okay, so now diving into the findings of the policy lab sessions. For our first session in November, we had 18 participants from all of these diverse sectors. We tried to cover as much as we can. The major chunk of participation was from producers or representatives from producer associations, as well as irrigation districts. We had representation from service providers, ag funding organizations, from the government, as well as academic researchers. And what we did is we did some basic research, and we gave them around 8 challenges out there that we thought were relevant to Alberta's agriculture. We did not start with digitalization because that's a solution, which we hope will organically emerge. So we had these 8 challenges that we had up there. And the first question was like, who came up with these? And so we were like, you tell us if they're relevant or not. So we again went back to the drawing board. And these were the 6 that were finalized. Some of them were actually not even in my 8. So ecological services came up from the producers themselves. The ones that you see on your screen are ranked as they were voted. So storage and peak flow got the most votes that people wanted to talk about. And extreme events to the bottom right got the least votes. And I'll talk about why that may be the case also in a little bit. So diving into what was discussed and what did we find? The first one, storage and peak flow. There was this general understanding that yes, there is a mismatch between when water is available and when there is peak agricultural demand. So what do we do about it? One thing that did come up, and this was an underlying theme across all the challenges, was infrastructure. So in this case, diverse storage systems. But another thing that came up, and this also is seen across, is nature-based solutions. So compensation to landowners to support natural storage solutions as well. And then I mentioned, we were hoping digitalization would organically emerge, and it did. We need improved forecasting, flow metering, and then use of satellite monitoring technology as well. And on the right-hand side, what you see are the way this discussion was conducted. We did have, verbal oral discussion happening. But again, in the spirit of inclusivity, the participants also had the option of kind of putting down their thoughts And something that comes from design thinking is a lot of use of these colorful post-its, which apparently invoke a lot of creative thinking. So you'll see a lot of color on some of these slides that I have up here. Okay, efficiency was the next one. Again, infrastructure comes up. Why do we not have updated infrastructure? A lot of economic pressures. And there is this urgent need to maximize water use per drop, because that's another thing that came up in the conversations, was that there is water available, but we are not efficiently using it. Nature-based solutions show up first among how do we work with efficiency, no-till practices, use of encouraging more wetlands, conservation cropping, and then financial incentives were also suggested, collaborative planning, and then again, digitalization coming up over here in terms of precision agriculture might help improve efficiency. Infrastructure itself was seen as a challenge, especially in terms of it being deficient, not being sufficient to fulfill current or future needs, more towards future needs, I would say. And then there's a need for upgrades, but there are long timelines and higher costs. So what do we do about that? Again, financial suggestions in terms of cost share agreements for upgrades, strategic investment nodes, but also more research in terms of basin water holding capacity studies. And then again, a digital solution over here in terms of we need to have proactive planning. If we have digital data and simulation tools available, we might be able to plan better for future infrastructure. The fourth challenge that was discussed was water allocation, and as you would expect, it was pretty contentious. A general agreement that is governed by complex systems, at different levels. But there were concerns about equity and representation because the FIT-PER system came into place a while ago and circumstances have changed. There are scarcity of allocations, especially in certain river basins, such as the South Saskatchewan River Basin. And so, of course, recommendations for reevaluation of the system, a need for inclusion of diverse voices, and then publicizing water agreements. I'll come to this a little later as well, which works towards trust in governance. But digitalization was mentioned in terms of transparent and dynamic allocation systems, especially given this changing water availability that we saw, drought in the forecasted early in the year, but then you have negotiations and then things change rapidly in the fall. The fifth one that was discussed was maintenance of ecological services. And as I mentioned, this did not come up in our research, but this was something that was stressed by the producers, where it was mentioned that these ecological services, such as wetlands, for example, are maintained by private landowners, but they also provide public benefits in terms of, improving the water table. But they do not actually get any compensation for it. And so that's kind of tricky because they themselves are trying to balance, increasing agricultural yield while at the same time maintaining ecological sustainability. And so, of course, suggestions like bringing back the beavers, but also, financial incentives should be provided to landowners for ecosystem service maintenance, for protection of riparian zones and wetlands. And one way to kind of quantify this could be, through the use of monitoring technologies like flow gauges. The last challenge that was discussed was extreme events. And I mentioned like this was the last that was voted, but I think one of the reasons was people assume that this is important. And so we don't really need to make a case for it. Again, discussions of it's of course extreme events are more frequent, more severe, which lead to significant risks. Infrastructure coming up again over here that we need to invest in adaptation infrastructure. Financial solutions in terms of insurance mechanisms. We need to plan for localized impact. So scale also comes up quite a bit in our conversations. And then again, a digital solution over here that we need improved forecasting to deal with extreme events. So again, I want to reiterate, we started with problem definition, just challenges, and no mention of digitalization. And then as you see over here, digital tools were mentioned or implied in the discussions in order to deal with these challenges. And so I have a list over here. I won't go through all of them, but you can see for yourself storage and peak flow suggestions of satellite monitoring, flow metering, forecasting tools. For water allocation, what was interesting was the use of digital registries. So everybody knows who has how much water allocated. And with this dynamic allocation system, so you can see how much water is actually being used and whether it can be moved around. So that was an interesting suggestion as well. So that was one whole day of discussions that yielded this kind of data, but actually half a day that yielded this kind of data. So we had the challenges, but then, of course, you need to prioritize because we don't have an endless supply of funds or resources to deal with these challenges. And so for the second half of the day, what we did was we moved into discussions of how urgent are these challenges? How many resources or how much effort do we need in order to solve these challenges? And so what you see up here was our attempt at a democratic effort where the whole group of 18 participants came together to vote and discuss, which of these challenges are most urgent, which require the most resources. And so what you can see up here is, again, at the top right over there is storage and peak flow, but then extreme events also shows up over there, although it was voted sixth in our line of challenges. We also have infrastructure, and interestingly, during these discussions, it was split into existing deficits and future deficits. And as you can see, the future deficits are up there, whereas the existing deficits are not as urgent because there was this understanding, especially from those within who work closely with the irrigation infrastructure, that the existing infrastructure is pretty sufficient. It's the future that we need to kind of be mindful about. And then ecological goods and services, the GS that you see on the screen, that also showed up there. Efficiency came down at the bottom, although it was upvoted second up there. In terms of yet, we already have made quite a bit of gains in efficiency, and all the future gains are going to require more kind of funding at the federal level, for example. And then we have two more kind of outliers. We had some suggestions of we need to include rights, water rights as well over here, but we could not come to an understanding of where to put that, so it just hung around outside. And then water allocation, as I mentioned, was pretty contentious. That little writing in there on that post-it actually says disagreement. So this democratic effort worked for the 5 other challenges that we had, but it did not work for water allocation because there's quite a bit of disagreement in the room in terms of whether it is actually urgent, how much effort do we need in order to deal with challenges in water allocation. So diving into the discussion that we had on urgency and effort, just a quick recap, but I do want to show some relevant quotes from these discussions. Storage and peak flow, I mentioned high urgency and effort. Infrastructure was kind of this big thing which is needed for long-term resilience. So these quotes kind of reflect that we do have the water in some senses. So we need a system that can manage the problem, capture the excesses, and distribute it in times of droughts. So that mismatch between water availability and agricultural demand. And then the second one, last year, we transmitted 58% water across the boundary instead of 50%, again, because we probably did not have the storage systems available. So it seems that there is this feeling, at least, that there is water available and it's not being managed properly. With efficiency, as I mentioned, the urgency wasn't seen as high, but the effort, especially because there's a small gap left, and it's what we were looking towards was more private sector innovation for future efficiency gains. Again, this understanding that if we are able to make more from what we have, then we might be able to get excess or surplus. And then the belief that we have improved efficiency so much, the remaining gains are smaller and less important. With infrastructure deficiencies, I mentioned split into existing versus future, and especially with future needs, there was this understanding that we probably need more federal support, so more funding, and we need to look beyond irrigation in terms of how might we support ecological services. So again, in terms of existing infrastructure, we are 63% pipeline now. The bulk of it has already been established. The next one was water allocation. There was this tussle between the multiple users and how the water allocation system might not be inclusive in that sense, where we have agricultural water users on one side, we have urban users, we have ecological needs. We also have other users who have historically been marginalized to the First Nations, which you will see do not come across in this policy lab as much. And I can talk about that later in the Q&A if that's the question. But with water allocation, I think there was this discussion about the need for reform, education, and then this broader stakeholder engagement, again, to promote inclusivity. And these two quotes will kind of show you that dynamic where on the one hand, you have a comment like most of the province can still apply for and receive a license, whereas which is true in some senses. And then on the other hand, we have something like it's highly political. Anything political is hard. Time is money. So hours in a room adds up. And so those negotiations reflecting like it would need, effort and resources to come together. And so we do see two distinct camps emerging over here. And then with maintenance of ecological services, this was very interesting to me because this came up really from that bottom-up approach where producers wanted this on the discussion board. And then one thing that was raised was in terms of difficulty of quantifying these ecological resources, because we do want to compensate landowners. So there are challenges of, how do we put it into policy, and then how do we put it into practice, especially coming from quantification. And these two quotes kind of reflect that urgency. These ecosystems have already been lost, so we need to maintain them now. And the markets for ecological services for the past 20 years are non-existent. So I think this definitely leads scope for more digitalization as well in terms of developing those markets. And then the last one, as you can see, high extreme events, high urgency, high effort, and a need for proactive adaptation, mitigation strategies. So infrastructure coming in quite a bit over here. And these show you that urgency. 1 in 100-year extreme events are happening more and more frequently. Extreme events are really an outcome of management. We have to start looking at it in a proactive way. So again, that management part comes in, which kind of nicely dovetails into our second session, where we had most of our participants coming back. We had a total of 20 participants from all of the groups that I talked about. And here we switched to governance because we spent a day on problem definition. What are the challenges? A lot of things emerged. One of them was we have the water, we need to manage it properly. So how do we do that? So again, going back to the drawing board, what's the research telling us? Research shows that most of the water crises across the world are actually governance crises. And so what we need are robust frameworks. And so for the purposes of the policy lab, we drew on the OECD principles on water governance put forth in 2015 and have been widely adopted, which are 12 principles related to implementing water policies. Pretty contextual because, of course, there is no one size fits all solution. And that's something that actually came up in our discussions. What works for Northern Alberta will probably not work for Southern Alberta because governance is highly context dependent. So these are those 12 principles. I won't go into definitions this time, but 3 buckets. How do we lead to effective water governance, efficient water governance, and how do we increase trust and management? And then, of course, contextual. The discussions were about how are these principles relevant to Alberta, water sustainability, and digitalization in agriculture. And what came up was this. Financing was one big one, the barrier and an enabler. There is, of course, financing or funding available, but pretty bureaucratic, sometimes not enough for the infrastructural change that's needed. Does not account for the difference in scale in terms of the funding needed by small-scale farmers versus large-scale farmers. And there is often a demand for matching funding, which is a barrier. Quite a few programs might be oversubscribed, so funding runs out sometimes in the middle of a project. Digital tools again came up in terms of digital service providers being able to, if they're able to provide free tools, that might encourage uptake. Regulatory frameworks, not so much. They were functional, slow to adapt, and changes. There was an understanding that these are time consuming and complex. After financing, I think data and information was the next one, which participants considered critical. There's a lot of data, but not really well organized, and sometimes there are gaps in data availability. And so that's where AI can step in to leverage large quantities of data. And then again, innovative governance, not as stressed. It was seen as emerging organically and need for investment and experimentation. Moving to the next bucket of effectiveness, in terms of whether roles are allocated clearly, as well as responsibilities, participants thought that the roles are pretty straightforward. Everybody knows what they're doing, but there's not a lot of coordination across them. And this will show up in one of the other governance principles as well. The other thing was scales, where that's foundational. We have data on the basin level, not applied to the farm level, so some inconsistency there. And then with policy coherence, which I talked about earlier in terms of the roles and responsibilities, not a lot of coordination. I have several quotes up here from participants. A lot of those sectors don't talk to each other around water. They are not very coherent or not talking among stakeholders. When you have silos within different departments, then you come up against barriers. So over here, these two, the coordination aspect and the scale were important. Capacity, not as much. High effort, but we need to more discuss in terms of there's a need to monitor, enforce, adapt governance, but not into, and it needs a lot of effort, but not much insight into how do we go about it. And the last bucket over here is trust and management, which was more discussed in terms of the need for open data, clear communication, and inclusive decision making. So this, I think, coming a little bit from the water allocation discussion as well. There's a massive trust issue, a closed door process, a black box process that's not open. So a lot of these agreements happen behind closed doors. So encouraging more transparency was one of the suggestions. And then bottom-up approaches, so letting them tell you what they need rather than going to them just with consultations. The last two over here are the trade-offs. And so being mindful of the fact that, producers are not the only users. So water allocation across agriculture, municipalities, industry need to consider the whole value chain. And then again, data and information coming up in monitoring and evaluation, that there's a need for regular evaluation, but for that, we need data as well as information available, which is lacking in some senses. So to sum that up, we had out of those 12 principles within the context of Alberta, these six that kind of popped up. Better financing avenues, need for data and information, working at the right scale, providing policy coherence, the coordination across the sectors, transparency in what is going on and making that data available, and then working directly with those who are impacted with those bottom-up approaches in some ways. And so what we did with that data that we generated was, it seemed like these were some of the implementation strategies that were being suggested. Defining appropriate scales, developing shared data infrastructure, simplifying the access to financing, building institutional capacity, and then that cross-sector coordination piece that I talked about, where there's not a lot of policy coherence, the inclusive stakeholder engagement, improving transparency and trust, a need to modernize the regulatory frameworks, especially in this dynamic system where water availability is pretty dynamic itself, and then encouraging innovation through pilots and partnerships, and lastly, regular monitoring of data. Where does digitalization come in this whole process? So some suggestions which are implied or mentioned are, we could enhance measurement. It could be used for enhancing measurement and monitoring. It could help in supporting decision making at multiple scales. It could enable innovation and other AI applications through other AI applications. It could reduce the administrative burden, improve access if data is easily available and transparently available. And then you will also be able to build trust through this transparency by using digital tools which are accessible by everybody. So with that, here we are again in that same slide that I started with. It was a long and winding road. We had challenges. We came down to some policy, well, at least governance principles, if not policy interventions. I gave you some vague implementation strategies of building institutional capacity, inclusive stakeholder engagement, and all of that. And now what we are hoping to do is moving to that policy roadmap where we move from that vagueness of those 10 implementation strategies, where hopefully when we meet in December with our participants and all of them are coming back, is set out some short, medium, and long-term actual policy strategies. Talk about who are those who are impacted, what are their roles, how can we coordinate across those sectors, what are the barriers that we have identified, some, as you saw, funding, data and information, all of that. How do we move past those barriers? Are there some enablers out there that we can work with? So that's kind of where we are at with the policy lab. And as I said right at the beginning, it's an iterative process. We want to work with those who are directly impacted. And so this webinar was kind of in that vein where we do want feedback. We are, of course, working directly with our 20 participants who are giving us feedback on where we are, where we should go. But we are also open to feedback from the wider community who are involved in this sector. And so we have an open kind of board up there in terms of, after having listened to the preliminary findings, what suggestions do you have to move toward a roadmap for water sustainability for agriculture in Alberta in the context of digitalization? You can use this QR code directly to go on to menti.com, or you can type in menti.com and use the join in code over here to give your feedback. So what I will do is we will turn the Q&A. Hopefully there are a few questions that you have about this policy lab. I'm looking forward to answering those questions. And I will leave this up here for you to provide feedback. And towards the end of the webinar, we will maybe put this up in terms of the feedback that we have received so that everybody knows what's going on, trying to make it a very inclusive and transparent process as well. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to hand it over to Roshan to facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Juhi. If anyone has any questions for Juhi, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible today. Maybe as people are collecting their thoughts, we can start with a question. Juhi, how is the policy lab different from stakeholder consultation?
Thank you. It's a good question in terms of how is it different. I think it emerged, at least from the literature, it emerged from stakeholder consultations. But what was found in the literature, I think, in some ways, was this one-way communication that's happening sometimes with consultations, whereas policy lab is a lot about creation as well. And so working with those who are impacted directly in terms of talking about the problems themselves. So in some ways, I think that's one of my main understandings in terms of the difference between the two. And then I think the use of design thinking. So how to encourage more kind of out of the box thinking in some ways, which is encouraged the designs of these policy lab sessions.
Thank you for that. I did see a hand go up and back down in the participant list. Just a reminder, if you have a question, please pop it in the Q&A section just at the bottom of your screen there. Juhi, can you speak a little bit more to the goal of the roadmap and how you would like to ensure that it has an actual policy impact beyond just research?
Great question. So in that sense, I think one, this project is funded by the Government of Alberta. So one of our goals is to provide policy recommendations. And with the policy lab, the short, medium, long-term policy strategies. So putting them down, like delineating them very clearly, I think is important in some ways. And I think that's one of our main goals, to be able to say that this is what the people who are impacted, are impacted actually want in terms of the changes that are happening. So we are hopeful that that's kind of our goal in terms of that roadmap, to very clearly outline where we want to go in terms of policy change.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions coming in the Q&A. We'll start with this first one here. Digital strategies are very scale dependent. I'm thinking about possible large-scale storage infrastructure or diversions versus digital solutions at the farm gate. How do we reconcile that paradigm? Do we need a family of policies?
That's a tricky one. So scale, I think, was discussed a lot in our uh, in our sessions, and also in terms of how they vary across dryland farming, irrigated farming, etc. as well. So yes, we would probably the roadmap sounds pretty easy, like we have this one roadmap that will apply across the province. That's likely not the case. What we will probably have would be different versions of it, which would be contextual in some senses. And that's, I think, where the governance principles also kind of come in, where we discuss them broadly and then shortlisted 6 which were more relevant. But in some contexts, some others might actually become more relevant. So yes, that family of policies, that's a good idea. It's a good suggestion in terms of using that rather than this generic large roadmap. So thank you for that.
Another question here. What are your expectations in terms of outcomes from Policy Lab 3 for the roadmap? Is there a draft roadmap that has organically emerged that we can react to and build on?
Yes. So there is a pre-version, I think, and not a draft as yet, because I'm hoping to get more feedback after today's session to have that actual draft ready. But there is a skeleton that we are working on, and what I have up here are parts of that skeleton. On what I have on the screen up here are parts of that skeleton. So there's implementation strategies that I had showed you all earlier. Over here is kind of what has in some ways emerged from the discussions so far. And this I'm hoping will then inform these key actions that I'm talking about. Okay, we have those implementation strategies in some ways. Now, what are some actions that we can take? Who are the stakeholders who we think are relevant in this case, who might be able to contribute to that? What are their roles? So again, a very iterative process. We kind of thrive on feedback in some ways and very appreciative of that. There is a draft. It will be shared among the participants to react to, so that there's something we can start from for the final session.
Thank you, Juhi. Another question here about the composition of the participants involved in these policy labs. How many farmers provided inputs? Were inputs limited to the two policy labs, or was there more consultation from farmers?
Good question. So, how many farmers? I think at least for both the sessions, we had, as I said, 18 and 20 participants respectively. And so at least half, or maybe a little less than half, were producers or those who were representing producers. So we did have a good chunk of participation from them. In the second session, we focused specifically on producers themselves in terms of their needs and challenges. We also, what we did was for both the sessions, we did send out a pre-survey uh, asking questions to help inform the design itself of these two sessions. And so that I think also we haven't done actually an actual count of how participation in terms of the different groups, but it was sent out as well, and we included producers in that list as well for the survey. So in all of that, to say that that's been our focus to work directly with producers, so that because they are the ones who are directly impacted by this issue.
Thank you, Juhi. Another question here. The discussion is based on digitalization in agriculture. Are there similar policy labs in place with other industries that are instrumental in water usage and distribution in Alberta? Or are additional policy labs required across industries?
Uh, So we have living labs in Alberta where we are testing out digital tools on farm, working with producers themselves. But in terms of policy labs, I don't think there has been as much of a proliferation, especially in the ag sector. And so I think there is definitely scope for setting up more policy labs. And again, that family of policies, I think I think taking a cue from that, we could probably, have more focused policy labs because here, as you saw, digitalization being this really big kind of umbrella topic, we tried to focus it on water sustainability. And then within that, we realized that, okay, there's more subgroups that we need to focus on. And so, yes, there's definitely scope for that. But whether there are any existing ones, I am not so sure. And across other industries as well, I think the idea of the policy lab, the concept of the policy lab comes from management more. So not as much in the agricultural sector as yet, but more in government, where it's government officials or representatives coming together, to brainstorm more policy. So again, kind of widening that up would be useful, I think, where we work with, the public.
Thank you. There's a question here about the timeframes of short, medium, and long-term policy strategies. So could you speak a little bit more to how long is these short, medium, and long term? So is short term 1 to 3 years or shorter or longer?
Still under process. So I have a skeleton of a draft. I said not yet a draft. Hopefully in the next few weeks before the final session, we'll be able to kind of finalize what those actual timelines are for these short, medium, and long-term policies. But I think so the short-term policies are definitely within the 1 to 2 year range. And the medium would be a little longer, but it's the long term that I have been kind of grappling with. And so what does long term mean? Because even in our discussions, we're like in the monitoring strategies, they came up to like 5 years, policies should be, and that's usually the political term, like every 5 years. But then we have these regulatory changes and we have this dynamic kind of water availability that's happening. And every year, sometimes, you have water license holders coming back to the table. And so ideally, I would like to see if there is something that we can come up with really long term, like maybe a 10 or a 20-year kind of big strategy. But I think realistically speaking, we are most likely at around 5 or 10 years for the long term range, at least.
Great, thank you so much. Two questions from a participant that kind of go together. How are policy labs and living labs different from each other? And then secondly, how is the policy lab looking at regional self-sufficiency of resources and food systems? So maybe starting with the first part of the question, how are policy and living labs different from each other?
So they're not. Living labs are kind of the big umbrella, and policy labs are kind of a subset of living labs. because the ultimate thing with living labs is working directly and testing out, a product, for example. So here the product is policy. And so that's why it's called a policy lab as such. But they fall under the same family. And then could you repeat the second question?
Yeah, the second part of that question there is how are the policy labs looking at regional self-sufficiency of resources in food systems? So I would assume in this case, the resources in question would be water, but
Mhm.
I'm happy if the person would like to clarify further with another question. Please go ahead.
So I think the assumption here is that right now that self-sufficiency is not there and that's a challenge in some ways, but also it's not being managed properly. And I think that's what we are looking at in some ways. Uh, and again, we did not want to start with there is a problem. We wanted to start with what is the problem. And so those were one of the 6 challenges that came up. And so I think that self-sufficiency itself is lacking in some ways. But again, yeah, if there is more to that question that I might be missing, please feel free to add to that.
Thank you, Juhi. We'll just wait a little bit if anyone else has any questions they'd like to submit. Maybe while we're waiting, I'll just ask something that came up during the presentation. You spoke a little bit to the involvement of Indigenous stakeholders and perspectives. Could you speak a little bit about that influence in the policy labs?
Yes. So this, I think, came up. So we talked about inclusivity, and I think one of the main groups that has been missing in these conversations is, the Indigenous stakeholders. And that wasn't purposeful, but we also were mindful of the fact that, we need to have a scope over here. And when we had those discussions on water allocation, I think we realized that that was one participant that was missing. And so what we are hoping to do is, at least in the next phase, uh, increase that focus in some senses, because uh, we want to stay true to the inclusivity of this whole process, and that was a major stakeholder group that was not included for various reasons, not purposefully, but I think starting from the ground up, that's something that we need to work towards, definitely.
Thank you, Juhi. Just a reminder, if you do not feel comfortable providing a question or giving us feedback here, you can feel free to reach out to our team. Juhi and myself, our emails are there at the bottom of the screen there. And we will also keep this Mentimeter poll up if anyone would like to submit a question or some feedback in that manner instead. Juhi, could you speak a little bit more to the process of how you went about selecting the participants for these policy lab sessions?
Sure. So I think, like, when I had that sort of a stakeholder map up there, one of the things we wanted to focus on was, making sure there's producers at the table. And so that's how we started this process of, who to invite. And it was an open invitation. It wasn't like, it's a closed door event. We did have limited capacity because we want to kind of have substantial kind of discussions. And so a limited group of 15 to 20 is what we were aiming at. But that's how we started, like producers mainly. And then we have our own kind of network through which we work with to make sure that, we reach out to the stakeholder map that we had created in terms of like who are the people involved. So I think that's kind of how the whole process was in terms of uh, figuring out, okay, this is the issue, who are the people impacted, and then reaching out to them, explaining to them, how this works, uh, and trying to get them all at the table. And it's been quite an effort, but I think uh, it's worked out in the sense that we've had the same participants and they've stayed with us for a year now. So
Thank you. And maybe for people that are a little bit more interested in this process, you've spoken a lot about iterative feedback throughout the process of the policy labs. Could you speak a little bit more to what has happened in between policy labs, because as you mentioned, this has been going on for almost a year now. So how have we kind of kept that momentum going and keeping participants engaged in between the in-person sessions?
One is feedback. I think after every session I had emails sent out one-on-one meetings for one-on-one meetings to ask them about, what they thought, what is it that they think was missing. And I think that was very crucial because after the first session, which was kind of our first attempt, like this is what we think, this is where we think we should be going. But then as you saw, this roadmap over here it took those turns because the feedback said, okay, I didn't really think this worked. Or, for example, those post-its were something we got feedback in terms of, maybe try something else. And so we went more digital in the next session. And then, what kind of questions do you want that were not answered in the earlier one? So I think it was, and I'm very thankful to our participants in the first place for, giving us their time to kind of talk to us in terms of, what they thought was missing, what they think they should be added. And I think that was very valuable for us to kind of take that turn to come to, March for the second session and now taking another turn and moving towards that roadmap.
Thank you. Um, Kind of a combination of a question and a comment here. It seems like there would be a need to dive much more deeply in the different digitalization items. The need, the benefit, the feasibility, including the cost, the limitations, reason limiting the adoptions, etc. This was not in the scope of the policy lab, was it?
No. So the exact digital tools themselves was not in at least this scope that we have over here. But then I introduced the ABDIAG program earlier, and so we have other things going on. We've been conducting interviews with producers and other kind of groups. We've conducted bigger surveys as well with producers, with I think more than like 300 or something. And so the policy lab is one part of this bigger ABDIAG project, and so I think all of that will then ultimately inform those policy recommendations that I was talking about earlier, which is, the final goal of the ABDIAG project. So within the policy lab, no, we are not focusing on those specifics because, again, limitations of time and resources. But we are mindful of, how important those are. And so we have other kind of works, projects going on within ABDIAG, which are focusing on that as well.
Perfect, thank you. And maybe just quickly, where can people go if they want to hear more about this ABDIAG program?
Oh, good question. So for the ABDIAG program, I'm not sure if there was a link within the webinar registration page, but you can just look up the Simpson Center and ABDIAG, and it's on our website among our research projects, which tell about the ABDIAG project. And we can also, when we send our post-event survey, we can include a link to ABDIAG over there as well if you're interested in learning more about the project.
Thank you, Juhi. Two comments here through Mentimeter. They kind of go together. So maybe this might be one of our last ones. I'm just keeping an eye on time. We'll see. The first one says, water sustainability is not only impacted and impactful to agriculture. Other industries utilizing large quantities of water, including urban centers, should be included in the roadmap. And then the second comment that came in here is agricultural and especially within digitalization can benefit greatly in cooperation with other industries for the management of water and ecological services. So maybe Juhi, could you speak a little bit to the role of other industries in this picture and what's the scope of the policy lab when it comes to that?
Definitely. So I think this came up earlier. Let me just see if I can pull up that slide. So over here, to the bottom left, so among the trust and engagement part, we have trade-off across users as one of the principles. It didn't come up as much, but definitely that consideration of, we need to consider the whole value chain. Because agriculture is just one consumer, one of the biggest consumers, yes, but it's still one of the consumers, and there are these competing claims on water. And so I definitely agree. That needs to be a part of the roadmap in terms of being mindful of the fact that agriculture is not the only consumer of water, and there are other competing users as well. And we need to kind of consider that whole value chain when we are talking about water sustainability in general. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any additional questions or comments coming in through any of our channels here. Just a reminder, if you would like to reach out to us directly, our emails are there. And this Mentimeter will stay live for a short while after the webinar has concluded, but please feel free to reach out to us directly at any time. So maybe with that, that might be a good place to wrap things up. Juhi, are there any final thoughts you would like to share with the group before we wrap things up?
Thank you so much for your time and also to our participants, because all of this data and research becomes possible because of the time that they have voluntarily agreed to share with us. So I just want to acknowledge, along with my team, whom I acknowledged right at the beginning, I think the participants themselves are a team for this policy lab. And so I do want to share that acknowledgement towards the end of this webinar, that I really appreciate their contributions.
Thank you so much, Juhi, for sharing those preliminary findings and key insights with us today. To everyone who joined the webinar and asked some questions, thank you so much for your engagement and participation. You will receive a link to the recording as well as a post-event survey. Please go to the Simpson Center website and subscribe to hear about more upcoming events from our team and to receive our monthly newsletter for information on research about Canadian food production. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.